Good evening. There it is. It's on. Well, welcome to our inaugural Connecting with Our World lecture. This is a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce our speaker this evening and to welcome you to this first event. You know, we had no idea how many folks to expect when we opened this up. We thought, we'll set up for about 150. We might get 200. We might have like standing room only. But I'm really glad to see you all tonight. That's the short way of saying it. Really glad. So thank you for being here and being a part of this. And I hope that this evening you will hear something that's thought-provoking, that raises some questions, that allows you to connect with our world in a new and more profound way. I'm going to read a little introduction now to our speaker this evening, Ying. Ying is a policy advisor for the Heartland Institute, and she writes regularly about China, international affairs, and the free market. Much of her research explores the nexus between political and economic freedom with respect to China's rising influence on the global stage. Her articles have covered issues such as the internet revolution, democratization, climate change, state capitalism, and market liberalization, and have appeared in the Wall Street Journal Asia, the International Herald Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the National Review Online, the Weekly Standard, Policy Review, and other publications. She's the author of Chinese Girl in the Ghetto, which she completed as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Ms. Ma has practiced law at Simpson Thacher & Bartlett, a leading global firm headquartered in New York, managed corporate communications at Sina.com, the first mainland China-based internet company to list on the NASDAQ stock market, and served on the first professional staff of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, a congressional commission established to examine the security implications of America's economic relationship with China. Ms. Ma received a BA in government, magna cum laude, from Cornell University, and a JD from Stanford Law School. She's a term member on the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's my pleasure to welcome her this evening. Ying.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ivan, for that very warm introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to be here with you all, and I'm really honored to be the first speaker of our Bible Presbyterian Church's lecture series. I am really grateful to the members and volunteers of the church who have put this program together and made it happen. I want to say a special thanks to Karen Orlando for having communicated with me via email in the past few months or so to coordinate my presence here. And I am really honored to talk to you all tonight about my book. The book is titled Chinese Girl in the Ghetto, and it is in essence a story about my family's journey from the insidiousness of Chinese authoritarianism to the horrors of inner city America. And it's a very personal account. I call it a chronicle of a journey of getting to know freedom from China to America. And the journey begins with the innocence of childhood. It takes you to a struggle against poverty, racism, and crime, and then it ends with freedom as my prize. More specifically, the story starts in China in the 1970s, where historical economic reforms were taking place and transforming the country into a more hopeful and more liberal place. And during that time, China had been wrecked by decades of totalitarian rule. So China's citizens were dirt poor and just completely desperate for a better life. I lived in the city of Guangzhou, which was the country's third largest city. And along with my parents, my brother, my grandparents, and two uncles, we all lived in a two-bedroom apartment that did not have running hot water, that didn't have modern toilet facilities, and that didn't have things like refrigerator or color television. But by Chinese standards, we were actually living very comfortably. So when China liberalized, we then came face to face with the excitement of the country's economy being open to the world, and we participated in the excitement of seeing and experiencing economic freedom for the very first time. And what that meant was that for the very first time, we, along with a number of other Chinese citizens, could buy goods on the open market instead of using food stamps allotted to us by the Chinese state. For the first time, we could open up businesses instead of being confined to lifetime government-assigned employment. For the first time, we could have possessions that we had not seen before, and this includes clothing that was not gray and drab, electronics that brought us images and music that we had never heard or seen before, and capitalist encumbrances that we didn't even know we coveted. So for those of us girls, this meant things like nail polish and lipstick and perfume, and those were really exciting things, and we didn't even know how exciting they were until we had access to them. And then also for the first time, we were exposed to foreign cultures to which we did not previously have access. We met tourists from the outside world. We watched movies that were from other countries. We read books that were from places like Hong Kong and Taiwan. And during this time, I got to watch my very first movie as well. It was a Sylvester Stallone movie, Rambo. I believe it was Rambo 2, First Blood, and I thought it was exciting. It was incredible. These were the very incredible things that we got to do during this time of economic reform that China was undertaking. And in the midst of this great economic expansion, we learned just how much all those years of communism had denied us. But at the same time, we grew ever more hopeful about our future and about all of the better things that were in store for us. Then my story in the book takes a turn in the mid-1980s. My family had an opportunity to leave China to come to America, and back then everyone we knew who could leave China wanted to leave, and everyone we knew who couldn't leave wanted to leave too. And so what we did was we left, and we hoped we expected that our lives here would be better than our lives in China in every possible way. Unfortunately, that didn't quite turn out to be the case. We arrived in inner city Oakland, California, and much to our surprise, here in the land of the free and here in the wealthiest nation on earth, we were confronted with crumbling schools, unsafe streets, and racist people. Our new reality, as it turned out, was one in which we had meager English skills and even more meager financial resources. My parents worked at menial jobs for long hours, at first for less than minimum wage. My family wore clothing that was purchased from Goodwill or handed down from our relatives. We used secondhand furniture, and at first my brother and I each slept on half of the bed. He slept on the box springs, and I slept on the mattress, and till this day he insists that I had a better deal than he did. But we shared a bedroom at the time, and so my retort is that he made a lot more noise when he slept, and so I definitely got the short end of the bargain. But there's more. As it turned out, inner city Oakland, California was also extremely racist. It didn't matter if we were Chinese, Vietnamese, Filipino, or Korean. We found out that our name was Chinaman, no matter what. And that was the case at school, on the streets, on the bus, at grocery stores, and seemingly everywhere and anywhere. At my high school cafeteria, for instance, a middle-aged Chinese vendor who spoke broken English was regularly told by rowdy students at lunch to hurry up and dumb-shade. And on the sidewalks, black teenagers would regularly creep up behind elderly Asian immigrants and frighten them with sing-song nonsense, using sort of these teenagers' worst imitation of the Chinese language. And at markets and in the streets, Asians would regularly be told, "Why don't you just go back to where you came from?" And most of the time, I said nothing and did nothing when these overt acts of racism occurred. But during the few occasions when I actually did respond, I was immediately faced with the threat of physical attack or actual physical attacks. And perhaps the most embarrassing part about this kind of experience wasn't so much the threats or the attacks themselves, but it was the fact that the other Chinamen who were witness to my humiliation pretended as if they were not part of our collective humiliation. Now, poverty plagued my new city as well. All around me, I saw storefronts that had shattered windows. Streets were pockmarked with potholes. Our bridges and tunnels were splashed with graffiti. And the streets downtown smelled of urine. Houses in my neighborhood made feeble attempts to keep out burglars with iron gates around their front yards. And that was because crime terrorized all of us who lived there as well. Drug dealing seemed more prevalent at times than employment in that city. Guns rang at night, and muggings took place regularly. Yet, despite the brokenness of Oakland, America offered us boundless opportunities. And so 5 years after my family's arrival in California, we achieved home ownership, albeit in a pretty bad neighborhood. And a few years after that, I made my way into an Ivy League college on the East Coast. One of the messages of my book is that there is really nothing inevitable about this story. At each stage, somebody made a choice and, did what we could to extract ourselves from the situation we found ourselves in when we first landed. So there was the mother who chose to become a seamstress at a sweatshop, even though she used to be a well-respected kindergarten teacher in China. There was the father who became a busboy who was constantly yelled at by his employers, even though once upon a time in China he was a well-respected senior mechanic trailed by all kinds of apprentices who dutifully referred to him as master. And then there were the children who chose to study day and night instead of hanging out on the streets or skipping school. And there was the family that chose to save, that chose to work hard and chose to live in rather meager ways because they wanted to save for home ownership rather than splurging on better snacks or long vacations or fancy clothing. And all of us chose not to bank on getting freebies in life, and during those times when we believed we had to compete, we chose to go an extra step or 2 or 10 because we believed that was what was required. And because of these choices, we made our way out of an impoverished and crime-filled neighborhood many years later. Certainly, we couldn't have possibly done it without help. Along the way, there were lots of people in the inner city who offered us a warm smile and a helping hand, who showed kindness instead of the ugliness of racial slurs or the shamefulness of a criminal act. And they chose decency over hate and charity over ignorance. And through it all, I realized that freedom is a complicated business. It offers no guarantees for success, and all too often it delivers heartbreak and unfairness and injustice. In my book, the stories from China are joyful and charming. After all, I was growing up during a time when communism was sort of a kinder and gentler affair. During my childhood, economic freedom was beginning to blossom in China. The state was increasingly withdrawing its presence from the lives of the citizens, and so the state was increasingly refraining from telling us where to work, where to live, and with whom to associate. And during that time, I did not and could not understand just the depth of the political repression that made communism tick. And it was only many years later, when I became an adult, that I learned all about the brutality of Chinese authoritarianism. But as a child growing up in China in the late 1970s and 1980s, I was happy and I was loved and I was well protected by those around me. By contrast, my stories from the inner city are pretty horrifying. In the ghetto, I saw a complete breakdown of law and order, a widespread sense of entitlement, and a total lack of personal responsibility. The welfare state was prevalent and dysfunctional, and it stood squarely in the way of the realization of freedom's full potential. I saw in the ghetto that in a free society, people could refuse to choose wisely, even though they had a full array of choices, and that people could also fail to take responsibility for their actions. Now, after all that gloom and doom, thankfully the story does have a happy ending, and despite all the horrors of living in one of the darker corners of this country, the beauty of being a citizen of a liberal democracy is that you can choose for yourself, and that was what I got to do. And now let me offer a few observations about the policy implications of my book. The book doesn't actually talk about policy, but I think it is quite relevant to a number of pressing issues that we are dealing with today. In the past few years, as a result of the financial crisis, there has been growing worry that the United States will be stuck for the foreseeable future in some sort of economic malaise. Additionally, there's been widespread pessimism about the inevitable decline of U.S. power. There has also been growing concern that China will replace us as the world's leader. And in fact, just last year, the International Monetary Fund predicted that China will overtake the United States as the world's largest economy come 2016. And so that's correct. That's only 4 years from now. And as a result of China's economic prowess, there's a temptation today to envy the Chinese government's ability to wield its authoritarian power and to throw big money at big projects. One of those projects is high-speed rail, which is something that we clearly wrestle with here in California, but a lot of people have pointed to the China example to say that we should spend money and plan big just like the Chinese do. And politicians and commentators repeatedly point to that Chinese example to talk about the need to spend big, not just on projects like high-speed rail, but also to spend big on renewable energy and to pump money into economic stimulus programs. Those are also two areas in which the Chinese government has dumped a lot of money. What I hope is that my book will offer perhaps a useful reminder that the sizzling growth that we see in China today actually began not with more government, but it began with less. began with people experiencing more economic freedom, not less, and that the Chinese economic miracle came about as a result of the unleashing of the entrepreneurial spirit of the Chinese people, and as a result of the state retreating from telling its citizens what to do and how to do it. At this point, the future growth in China actually depends very much on the continuation of that reform process, and we will, of course, have to find solutions to many of the problems we face here, but one of the things that I hope my book will remind people is that perhaps we should, if we're going to look for models, certainly one thing we should do is to see the limitations of these models clearly, and there are clear limitations to the China model, and big government definitely is not one of the lessons of the China experience. Now, on the national level here in the United States, in the past few years, our political leaders have bickered over the solutions for a whole host of big issues. They range from lowering the national debt to reforming our tax policy to reducing the burden of our entitlement programs and so on and so on. And in a number of these debates, race actually has popped up as a very contentious issue. So, for instance, Speaker Newt Gingrich not too long ago was called a racist for labeling President Obama as the food stamp president. And President Obama's critics, particularly those of the Tea Party, have been accused of practicing racism because they've been very critical of the president's policies. Representative Pete Hoekstra from Michigan, or former Representative Hoekstra from Michigan, has been criticized for an ad that he ran during the Super Bowl, and he was criticized for running the ad in a way that was racially insensitive to Chinese people. Are you guys all familiar with the ad, or should I describe it a bit? So during the Super Bowl halftime in Michigan, Representative Hoekstra ran an ad featuring an Asian American woman who spoke perfect English, faking broken English, and the point of the ad is that his opponent is very much in favor of spending, and that if she had her way, the government would just keep on spending and spending. And the woman in the ad pretended to be someone from China, and she said, you know, it would be bad for you and great for us. And Representative Hoekstra was accused of doing a very racist ad because clearly the woman, I mean, there are a whole host of reasons, but that was sort of the gist of it. And then, in an issue completely unrelated to policy, just recently, an ESPN headline writer was fired for using the headline "Chink in the Armor" when he was referring to basketball phenomenon Jeremy Lin. I take it Jeremy Lin probably is someone that you all know better than Representative Pete Hoekstra. So I probably don't have to describe this incident. Anyway, but on all of these very contentious race-related issues, I hope that my book will offer some useful reminders too, because after all, I spend a whole lot of time talking about racial strife in my book. And the message of my book is pretty simple. I believe that racism is wrong no matter who perpetrates it, and no matter who's at the receiving end of it. And it doesn't matter if people are white or black or Hispanic or Asian. And if an ethnic minority or anyone else is facing racism, we shouldn't hesitate to defend him. But at the same time, if an ethnic minority is behaving in a racist fashion, we should also not be afraid to condemn him. Now, a corollary to this message is that just because someone is a minority doesn't mean that the person is then somehow immune from criticism. We really should see people as individuals rather than racial tokens. Certainly, we should not stand by quietly when someone is facing racism, but at the same time, we shouldn't run around crying racism when it's not there. So this means that I think politicians who are black or white deserve their fair share of criticism if their policies are not working. And just because President Obama is black doesn't mean that he is immune from criticism. This certainly doesn't mean that I would support racist attacks against President Obama, but attacking his policies in and of itself is not a racist act. It also means that running an ad like Representative Pete Holstra did is actually quite clumsy. It's a bit hard to describe it if you haven't seen the ad, but one thing we should also remember is that racial clumsiness or racial insensitivity doesn't always take away from the pressing issues that the racially insensitive person may be trying to highlight. So in Representative Pete Holstra's case, his message that if we keep on spending and spending, and if we continue to have uncontrollable government spending, it will come back to haunt us. That's actually a very valid message, but it's unfortunate that it was aired in a way that was extremely insensitive. Additionally, what my message also means is that you've also got to be willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. So when a sports writer or a sports headline writer uses language that's quite commonly used in our daily lives, as well as in sports coverage, like the phrase "chink in the armor," and when that phrase actually has a very unfortunate racist connotation when lumped together with Jeremy Lin, we should at least give the headline writer the benefit of the doubt. He says, his writing of the headline actually was entirely unintentional, and as Jeremy Lin himself has said, you really need to learn to forgive, and people need to learn to move on, and what we shouldn't do is dwell on imaginary racial grievances when they're not there. When people all make mistakes and they sometimes say unfortunate things, and we should try to give them the benefit of the doubt if the intention is not racist. Of course, all of this is easier said than done. One of my favorite quotes from former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld is that freedom is untidy, and I think that is certainly something that the stories in my book do reflect, and it's a very untidy affair to live in a free society. Unlike living in an authoritarian regime, nobody sort of issues a decree and tells us what to do, although these days a lot of us are complaining that many of our politicians are in fact doing just that. But in a free society, we've got to argue with each other about what sort of policies we wish to pursue. We've got to persuade our fellow citizens of the merits of our argument, and we've got to jostle with each other over the role that we want our government to play in our lives. And all of this is a privilege as well as a responsibility, and it's a privilege and a responsibility that I would not have had I grown up in China, despite the charming and joyful stories from my childhood. And so this is why the message of my book, Chinese Girl in the Ghetto, is that freedom is worth choosing. And if you read the book, I hope you will agree. And with that, I will take any questions you may have.
How old were you when you left China?
I was 10 years old.
Your family decided to move to the inner city of Oakland, China.
It's funny, we had relatives there, and because we were so eager to leave China, just like so many other Chinese citizens were eager to leave, we just saw Oakland as our ticket out. We weren't particularly picky about the location, and when you have meager financial resources like we did, the best thing to do is to go where you have friends and relatives, and we had a number of relatives in Oakland, and so we came and we showed up. I guess if I saw a story in the Wall Street Journal the other day talking about these very wealthy Chinese people who are thinking about immigrating here, and these are the people who have become extremely wealthy over the last few decades of China's economic reforms, and so they're not going to move to Oakland for sure. Certainly not, I mean, definitely not interested in Oakland, and so they've got their pick. You know, I think the rule is if you invest $10 million in the U.S. and create 10 jobs over a certain amount of time, then you're entitled to immigration privileges. I don't know the details about our visa policy, but nowadays, as a result of China's economic reforms, a lot of these wealthy people from China will have that opportunity. But that was an opportunity that we didn't have, my family didn't have, so we just took off for the first American city that would take us. Yes.
Are your parents still here?
Yes, my parents are still here in California. Yes, sir.
I was curious, is there any race discrimination in China?
Oh, there is a lot. There is a lot of, and China, I think, is a country that is much more overtly racist than America is. I think Americans have wrestled with our racism. We fought a war over slavery, and in our history, race is an issue that we as a country has wrestled with. And China is very different. For one, I think when I was in China, I didn't experience any racism because I lived in a very homogenous society. I looked like everybody else around me. Nobody was going to make fun of me for being a Chinese person. China does have numerous minorities, and I think there are a lot of minorities who are rather discontented. And this actually has to do with policies, in addition to racism, but I think it has more to do with policy. So you probably have heard about the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, and they all feel that they live in autonomous regions that ought to belong to them as sovereign countries. And a lot of these Tibetans and Uyghurs feel that the Chinese government invaded their land and conquered them, and now are